Hello, everyone. Welcome to YP4's Instagram Live. My name is Andrea Sosa. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the co-director of Young People 4. I'm super excited to chat with y'all today. Thank you for joining. I see y'all joining. Hey, y'all. So for those of you that don't know, Young People 4, we are a social justice incubator. We provide lifelong social justice leadership training to young folks that have been historically left out of opportunity. We're a national network of that centers Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, and LGBTQ plus leaders that are leading in education, media, politics, business, government, and basically everywhere. And I see some of y'all joining. Hey, y'all. Thanks for joining. So every month we are hosting these IG Lives to offer insight and just contextualize what the heck is going on in the world and talk about things like, how do we hold our elected officials accountable in this time? Or what best practices should we be using as organizers right now in all of the wildness that's happening? Or what's at stake for our communities right now? So we're really excited to get started. We are going to be chatting today to contextualize what really happened at last month's display of white supremacist violence at the Capitol, and really challenged us ourselves to rethink what the respond to white supremacy should be, and strategize ways that we can dismantle it. We have two amazing folks to talk us through all of this today. Yazan, Zaza, and Nicole Nguyen, who created a toolkit just for that. So we're super grateful to have both of these awesome speakers with us today. And we're going to start off by welcoming Yazan, and then later, and a little bit later, we'll have a chat with Nicole. So we are going to go ahead and super excited for y'all to meet them. For folks that are just joining, this Instagram Live is part of a larger Instagram Live series that happens every month to come together, be in community, and chat about what the heck is going on in the world, how we should be thinking about the issues that affect our lives on a daily basis, and ways to strategize for our communities and organize in this wild time. So we have some awesome folks today that are going to speak with us on contextualizing white supremacy. We know that last month there was a very blatant display of white supremacist violence at the Capitol on January 6th. So we're going to chat with some folks that actually created a toolkit to help us understand what happened and what we can do about it in our communities. So we're going to have our folks join now. Let's see if we can see them. Give them some love in the chat so they know that we're ready. Hey, Yazan, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Hi. Sorry about that. I was having some issues, but I got it worked out.
No problem. Let's give Yazan some love in the chat. Some waves or some hearts or some exclamation points. Yes, you're getting all the love. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you introduce yourself and let folks know your name, your pronouns, and a little bit of the work that you do?
Definitely. So my name is Yazan, and I am the community organizer at Vigilant Love. So VL is a healing justice organization based out of Los Angeles. A lot of our work uses art and organizing and a healing justice framework to really think about how political violence creates trauma, but also requires anti-repression work in response. So VL tries to really hold all of those complexities at once. Myself, I am someone who has been organizing in different communities, primarily Arab communities in the US for the last 10 years or so. And I'm also doing my own research on surveillance and countering violent extremism and how that relates to war abroad.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you. Let's give Yasan some love here in the chat. We're here to talk about rethinking our response to white supremacy. And to contextualize, we know that on January 6th, that was a reminder for our communities, something that our communities have known for so long, right? That white supremacy is baked into American democracy. Can you contextualize what happened that day at the Capitol and how we should be framing these conversations when we speak to our family, our community, and folks that we organize with?
Yeah, totally. So I think that January 6th is really complicated. And the initial response that a lot of us have is really, really charged with a lot, like a very heavy emotional reaction. I think for a lot of people, it's really triggering to see people who identify as white supremacists sort of making these really bold claims, this sort of public sensational display. And we saw a lot of political communities and organizations responding in this way of condemning these folks and of calling this terrorism or these different things. And I think at VL, a lot of our conversations were looking at like, yes, there's a really valid emotional reaction that people are having that is trauma from generations of state violence from white supremacy. It's a lot of anger, it's a lot of hatred at being criminalized by a state that actually condones this kind of behavior, right? Like there's a lot of really complicated feelings that come up. But what we also noticed was there's a lot of folks who were maybe reacting in a way of, well, I am someone who's been criminalized by the state, and it's validating to see these folks being criminalized in a certain way, right? Like, I think all of us on one way or a level, like, feel tired of being criminalized in a certain way. And there's some sort of relief that's really short term that people feel by being able to say, like, these folks are criminals who should also be labeled terrorists too, who should be labelized in a racialized term too. And that's, I think, something that is understandable. But when we think long term, it's really important to step back and think, well, wait, this country has very comfortably enacted violence against Black and Brown communities for centuries. Even most recently, when we think of police brutality, this country's very comfortable with letting police officers even go, right? Or they might make an example of one or two police officers who have killed someone who is Black, right? But generally speaking, this country has done very little to show that it structurally actually cares about Black and Brown people. So I think sometimes what we like to talk about at VL is thinking about what's the motive? Why is the state calling these folks January 6th terrorists? Is it because they condemn white supremacy too? Or do they have something to gain if they're able to separate themselves from these people, right? If they're able to say, no, this isn't what we believe in, focus your attention on these people as exceptional, but don't notice our white supremacy when we let police officers get away with murder, right? Or don't notice our white supremacy when we up the budget in war, right? Or these kinds of things. So I think motive is something that's really important to think about when we think about the language that's being used by the state.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And you mentioned language, and sometimes there is very intentional use of the language in legislation or in efforts to combat white supremacy or a lot of different issues that we face. What is the role of language, particularly when dismantling white supremacy?
Totally. I think something that's really important is the state is not going to offer us the tools to sort of fight its own violence, right? Terrorism is a state constructed concept. Terrorist language is something that the state, right, the United States government in particular, really relies on for passing laws, for waiving privacy rights, for policing people, especially people who are not immigrant, I mean, who are not citizens, right? So I think for language, in terms of dismantling white supremacy, there is more than enough implied by calling these folks white supremacists, right? That already means a lot, right? White supremacy does not need something after it. White supremacy is inherently violent. And it's important for us to really think about, why do we need to add more terms to the end of this, right? There is so much violence coded in white supremacy alone. And if we start to allow ourselves to see that as the actual violent threat, then we can start to think, okay, white supremacist ideology is violent. The United States government relies on this too. So then it allows us to say, these folks are white supremacist and the government is white supremacist, and this is violent for us no matter what. So I think it allows us to not specialize or sort of focus in on certain people, and instead lets us think about, well, what is white supremacy from the start? because that alone is violent enough for us to unpack, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that's really important. And I think for language in terms of terrorism too, there's so much that gets passed when terrorism is included in legislation and in bills. It's basically a free pass in the government when something talks about anti-terrorism or counterterrorism work. And there's a lot of people who get implicated in that. So I think interrogating language more closely and thinking about who are the people that are either being like absolved of their responsibility if we say white supremacist extremists instead of just white supremacy, or who are the people that will be criminalized when we call white supremacists extremists too? Who are the other communities that we're not talking about that are going to get penalized for this?
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that. And I mean, you said it perfectly. White supremacy is inherently violent. And, language plays a big role in that is enough to call violence and use as a justification for violence on our communities. So you helped create a toolkit that talks about how we should unpack this and how we should be talking about this and tools for our communities to combat white supremacy on all levels. Can you tell us a little bit about this toolkit?
Sure. So I got to work with Nicole Nguyen on this toolkit, and the initial question that we were starting with is just like, what are the kinds of questions that people tend to have when you talk about the government program Countering Violent Extremism? So Countering Violent Extremism is this program that claims to like stop radicalization by offering tools for community wellness in the form of grants that would lead to like after school programs, or it would lead to more nonprofit programming or different kinds of things. And so a lot of times people are really quick to support this programming because it is quote unquote counterterrorism, it is national security, but like it's perceived as something that's more gentle or nicer. And so there's a lot of civil rights issues that come up with this program. It's super racialized, it's super Islamophobic, it's super xenophobic, it's anti-Black racist. Like there's so many problems with this program. But when you tell people that they should reconsider their support for a program like this, they tend to have a lot of questions. And one of them is, well, what about white supremacists? Because CVE claims to target white supremacy. The fact of the matter is, in praxis, it's not white supremacists who are being systemically targeted by ICE, right, or by DHS as a result of CVE. Whereas the number of deportations that have taken place from when CVE was launched until now for communities that are targeted by CVE programming is astronomical. Like there are so many court cases of people being deported based on like $100 material terrorism charges because of counter-violent extremism frameworks. So our toolkit is really like, why should we separate our desire for criminalizing white supremacy from what the state will actually do? And is the state actually capable of criminalizing white supremacy when the state itself is white supremacist, right?
Mm-hmm.
These kinds of tools are not meant to actually address political ideas or ideologies. So
Mm-hmm.
white supremacy as an ideology is not going to be addressed by the United States government. What they'll address is these people embodied white supremacy in a way that makes us look bad. So we're going to criminalize them for that, but they're not actually being punished for the fact that they believe in white privilege, for the fact that they believe that white supremacy should exist. So I think these kinds of things are really important to think about. And that's what the toolkit, like in a nutshell, is unpacking.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And we've put the link here of the toolkit in our chat so folks can access it and read it. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the counter-violent extremism, the CVE framework that you just mentioned with Nicole a little bit later on. We're excited to chat with Nicole. And so I want to ask you another question. In the toolkit, you all talk about that there's more than just overt expressions of violence, but also very mundane and everyday covert forms of racism. What are some ways that we can combat white supremacy in our daily lives and interactions?
Totally. So I think for starters, not separating out. So in that toolkit, we have this little pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid is like really extreme forms of white supremacy. So you'll see things like January 6th is a great example. But the pyramid itself, at the bottom of it, the foundation is slavery. It's colonialism and the genocide of Native Americans. It's NAFTA, right? It's like popular trade agreements right now that the United States government is engaged in, capitalism. These really big picture things that don't often get referenced as also white supremacist. And so what the pyramid is trying to do is trying to show you wouldn't have moments like January 6th if this country didn't rely on things like slavery for its foundation. And so what we're talking about is it's really important to like recognize that this is dangerous, this is a threat. January 6th is scary. It's okay to say that, but to really think about, did it come from nothing, right? And so for us, thinking about how many different ways is white supremacy a day-to-day part of our lives, in ways that doesn't really get checked, right? So thinking about how school programming, right? Access to ESL education, thinking about the likelihood of someone who's Black being pulled over by a police officer and experiencing police violence, right? Thinking about how people who are traveling, who is more likely to be pulled over, surveilled, who's more likely to be interrogated. These things that get registered as normal or as day-to-day protocol that are actually very, very indicative of the fact that this entire country relies on white supremacy, right? You think about redlining for houses, right? Where communities of color tend to be located in terms of their proximity to toxic waste sites, right? Who has access to parks? Who has access to grocery stores? These are all things that are indicative of systemic white supremacy, but they will never be compared to January 6th, right? Even though they're both based on the same ideology. So I think things like that are really important to think about.
Yes, thank you so much. And for folks that are joining you, we have the link. We're dropping it again for the social toolkit that was created by Yazan and Nicole, who will now be joining us in a little bit, so that you all can see exactly what we're talking about and read more about it. Yazan, you've done an amazing job of breaking it down for us. Um, we'll make sure to for folks to follow the Vigilant Love Instagram for more information. And anything last minute words that you want to say to folks before we hop Nicole onto the chat?
Just that we're super grateful to be here. We really, really want to build with you all directly. And for anyone who's interested in learning more about Vigilant Love's work or our campaigns, we love getting to connect with folks directly. So feel free to contact us. We're always happy to build with folks.
Thank you so much, Yazan.
Thank you.
Awesome. So we now have a second guest speaker that we are going to bring on. Super excited to have not just one, but two amazing folks share their brilliance and their knowledge with us. So we are going to have Nicole, who is the co-author of this report that we're talking about, join us and talk a little bit more about what this counter-violent extremism framework is, and how we can identify it and ways that we can combat it and alternatives. Thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you please introduce yourself, let folks know your pronouns, and a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm Nicole. I use she, her pronouns. I'm actually a faculty member at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and my research focuses on this relationship between anti-terrorism and the policing and criminalization of communities of color, political dissidents in the United States.
Everybody, let's welcome Nicole. Give Nicole some love here in the chat. Thank you for joining us. So with Yasan, we talked a little bit about the dichotomy of countering white supremacy, but being careful about the frameworks that are used in our government to actually do that. And we they talked a little bit about the counter-violent extremism framework, right? CVE. Can you talk a little bit about that and contextualize it for us, and how did it come about?
Sure. So countering violent extremism, or CVE, is a federal anti-terrorism framework. Hopefully you can hear me. Okay, yeah. It's a federal anti-terrorism framework that was actually a response to communities of color saying, in the name of national security, you're over-policing, over-surveilling, over-criminalizing us. And so the government said, okay, we'll give you this liberal alternative. So instead of the police going into mosques, community centers, we're now having social workers, guidance counselors, teachers, use their daily practices to identify, report, and work with people who they think are future terrorists. And so the government has said this is an equal opportunity program. We're going against foreign fighters, we're going against ISIS, and we're also going against white supremacists. So it can't be racist because, you know, white supremacists are a part of what we're trying to do. And as Yazan said, like, invariably this directly criminalizes and targets communities of color in a way that it doesn't white communities. And also, to Yazan's point, this approach is also about individualizing the problem of political violence, which absolves the US government. So if we think of ISIS fighters, we blame their cultural or theological pathologies. We don't have to think about US war, foreign policy, in thinking about the making of political violence. And the same is true with white supremacists, right? We could just say that there are these extreme people who believe in these extreme white supremacist ideologies, and we just have to fix or reform these individual people. We don't have to think about structural racism. We don't have to think about, you know, transforming the distribution of resources, you know, healthcare systems and the like. So it's really about a liberal justification to police and criminalize communities of color while appearing to not do that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And you know, you broke that down wonderfully. So if the government, if we don't have CVE programs, right? What is the alternative? What are the alternatives to combating white supremacy through legislation or through other means that we should be, as organizers, advocating for, organizing for, educating our communities for? What's the alternative?
Yeah, I think we should be wary of state interventions. Like, we have to really consider, can the state help us with this problem of white supremacy when the state itself is white supremacist, right? To go back to Yazan's earlier point. And I think we could turn to, you know, our ancestors in history to think about how, you know, the Black Panthers mobilized into direct actions against the KKK neo-Nazis, right? So how do we mobilize our own communities to confront and contest white supremacists? Not to say that white supremacy is a problem people of color need to fix, but to understand that the way that our communities become safe is not through state intervention, right? It's us making ourselves safe and not depending on the systems and structures that criminalize communities of color, one of which is the criminal legal system. So, you know, maybe we can create legislation that ensures, you know, services that aren't used for surveillance. But really, if we're going to confront the problem of white supremacy, we can't turn to white supremacist institutions. We can't turn to the state. We sort of have to mobilize ourselves to do that kind of political work.
Yes, that's exactly it. And a lot of it involves, like, you know, our own communities coming together and building those systems for ourselves, because like you said, that is what keeps us safe. We know what keeps us safe. At YP4, we talk a lot about holding elected officials accountable, right? Elected officials, we know that at every level of government, control very critical aspects of our lives, from our education to the water that we drink to side of the street, you know, all of these aspects of our lives. I think we might have lost Nicole for a second. Let's see if we can get Nicole back.
I can still hear you.
You can still hear me. Amazing. I hope folks can still hear us. Looks like we still have folks watching. Hey, y'all. Okay, you're back. So, you know, holding elected officials accountable at every level of government. When an elected official comes out and says that they're condemning white supremacy, right, or that they want to take actions, you know, how right now should we be holding elected officials accountable? You mentioned that, you know, we should be wary of going to the state for finding solutions, but what does accountability look like?
Yeah, I think for me, this is a both and of, you know, what are the short-term goals while we're kind of building a world without the state as it currently exists. So, you know, certainly, you know, people are fighting for police community accountability for police. And this is not to say we shouldn't be fighting for these things, right? But if prison abolition is our end goal, right, we're eventually fighting for, you know, getting rid of police altogether. But, you know, we need, you know, elected officials to redirect money from the police to services, right? And so I think we can put pressure on those elected leaders while understanding that, you know, societal transformation, social transformation isn't going to come only through, appealing to our elected officials. Like, a lot of it is we have to do this work ourselves. We also have to build the pressure to sort of force political leaders to take unpopular stances, among the political elite. So I do think that that's important, right? Like, everyone wants, safe access to drinking water, to shelter, right? And in the short term, political leaders, can do some harm reduction in that sense. And also at the same time, we also have to think about how are we sort of building, towards that world without, police, without these really harmful institutions, right? How do we provide healthcare for all, not within the current healthcare system that, is about killing brown and Black people? And so I think, again, like, it's how do we do it for ourselves, and elected officials can sort of contribute to some of the short-term gains that we're looking for.
Yes, I love the way you said it. It's a both and, because one of the things we always talk about at YP4 is we know that elected officials will not be our saviors, and thinking about it as harm reduction, right? How can we be the most strategic possible and build towards the world that we want, using all of the opportunities to build power possible? So what are some of those organizations that are leading the response against the counterterrorism, right? Against counterterrorism right now, that we should be following, that we should be knowing about, that we should, that we want, that folks that want to know more and follow organizations that are leading this work, where can they go?
Yeah, so of course, Vigilant Love, they have their Services Not Surveillance Coalition. You can email Yazan if folks are interested. There's also the hashtag Services Not Surveillance. The Stop LAPD Spying is another group. They host weekly community education sessions on surveillance and counterterrorism that has a lot of youth organizers. The Muslim Justice League, the Dissenters, and there's a national Stop CVE coalition that, again, if you contact Yazan, can get you plugged in and connected.
Yeah, awesome. And so we'll make sure to give you all the information about how you can contact Yasan. We're putting in some information here about the toolkit so that folks can continue their own, self-education and exploration on this topic through the toolkit that you all put together, which was absolutely amazing. And also make sure to follow the Vigilant Love account. And if you do want to be connected to Yazan, we make sure to send us a DM. We'll make sure that you get the connections that you need. And Nicole, is there anything, any last words or calls to action that you want to say for any of the folks watching?
Just to say again, thank you for having us, and we're happy to talk to folks offline if folks are interested, and we just appreciate the opportunity to build together.
Let's build. Thank you so much, Nicole, for joining.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. And thank you all so much for joining. Like we mentioned, this is the one of our monthly IG live chats, where every month we come together to be in community, to deconstruct what is going on in our world and how we should be organizing our communities, how we should be thinking about the issues that affect us on a day-to-day basis, how to hold our elected officials accountable, and how to organize. So thank y'all so much for joining, and we will see you next month for our next IG Live. Bye, y'all.